Welcome to Nature Calls, Conversations from the Hudson Valley. Our team's goal is to present science-based information about gardening and all things nature in New York's Hudson Valley. Hosts Jean and Tim, along with team members Teresa and Linda, are Master Gardener volunteers for New York's Columbia and Greene counties. So if you're interested in gardening or nature, or nuggets of information about what's happening outside your door, settle in. Enjoy the conversation. Whatever the season, we have something to say.
Today we're with fellow Master Gardener volunteer Devon Russ and her friend Jenni Cawein. The topic is their road trip to the West Coast in pursuit of the fabulous Monarch butterfly. Welcome, Devon and Jen. As our listeners might know, Devon joins us from time to time with a commentary about myths and misconceptions about gardening. Now we're talking about one of her adventures.
Devon and Jen, I'm really excited to have you here. Tell us about what inspired you to go on this trip.
Well, we took a trip over the winter to Mexico to see the place where the monarch butterflies migrate to spend the winter. And it was just absolutely beautiful. And I must say, it was Jen's idea.
Yeah, I've been wanting to do this for years, ever since I learned about this migration. And I've always loved butterflies, and even as a child. And when I learned about this mass migration, I started noticing them in my garden and up here. And so I always wanted to see where they went. So I heard about this great tour that Natural Habitat, World Wildlife does, and ecotourism. So I wanted to go, and I was looking for a friend to go with. And then I thought, who would be most likely to go? And I thought of Devon. When I asked Devon, she's like, sure, I'd love to go. So
let me ask a question about the tour itself before we even get into the butterflies. So is it one place that you go to? How do you get there? Were there hijinks along the way? Tell us.
We flew to Mexico City to join the group. So we spent one day in Mexico City, and Jen and I had a lovely time touring the Grand City Park in Mexico City and the Anthropological Museum and things like that. And then we joined our group, and they have little buses, and they take us off to the mountains. It's several hours away from Mexico City. And quite a high elevation. You get up to close to 10,000 feet. And that's where these tiny little butterflies, they go to this one forest. It is absolutely stunning. When they're there, you go and you see so many thousands and tens and hundreds of thousands of butterflies hanging off the branches of these pine trees. It's just amazing.
And what time of year is this?
This was February.
Can you hear their wings flap?
You can. There are so many. And there are signs everywhere in the forest telling people to be silent, partly for that reason. And there'll be a fair number of tourists, local tourists and international tourists. And of course, the butterflies can move from day to day. So there'll be an area that you're allowed to walk around that's mapped out with surveyor's tape so that you don't disturb the butterflies too much. You don't go right into the middle of the colonies. You look at them from a few feet away. And people are there, and everybody follows the signs about being silent.
See, I don't think Jean and I could go even into Mexico, let alone there, because I don't think we could be silent, could we?
No.
It was wonderful to be able to hear their wings because there were just so many individual butterflies in the trees.
Do you have to hike in through the forest? I can't just be like by a parking lot.
We hiked sometimes, and we used horses sometimes because you do, as I said, it's at the town where you start from to see the butterflies is at high elevation. But then, of course, the butterflies are further up the mountainside, so you have to go to where they are that day.
Wait, you said horses?
There were horses, yeah.
You're going in on horseback for part of the way?
Another reason we can't go. And the climate is very specific there, right? Why do they go to that specific place? Do you know?
Yeah, it's a specific kind of tree, an area in the Sierra Madre. So this is central Mexico. They found 12 places where the butterflies go. 4 of them are open to tourism. So 4 of them are sanctuaries that people can actually visit. The trees that are there are called oyamel fir trees, or they call them avis religiosa. The tips of the branches have like crosses, and the needles are just the right size, they explain to us, for them to hang on to. When they go there, they stay there for about 4 months of the year, I believe it is, and they have to conserve their energy, so they go into something called diapause, where they don't reproduce. They have to conserve the temperature, and this provides like a microclimate where the temperature's right. It provides protection from like wind, and sometimes occasionally it snows there even. And they have to preserve their energy, preserve enough so that they can fly back. So they fly back maybe to like Texas, and then that generation dies. And then there are actually 4 generations that go through this cycle. So it's actually the great-grandchildren who fly back. So they've never been there before. It's just a system that's fascinating, and it's the largest migration known in terms of numbers of individuals. There are literally 50 million butterflies in one of these sanctuaries. It's just amazing part of nature to see this.
And they're not eating while they're there, right? Or are they?
There's very little for them to eat. There are some things flowering, but there's not enough food.
So it's like a dormancy, that 4 months and restoration.
It's not really hibernation, but it's called diapause. And they actually, when the sun hits these clusters of butterflies, sometimes they start to fly. And we learned that part of the reason to fly is actually to cool themselves back down, because by soaring a little bit, they can cool their wings, and they're trying to maintain the right temperature.
By the way, that's one of the beautiful things to see there when you first go up to the place where the butterflies are hanging in the fir trees. What you see they look like big black sacks just hanging off these trees. And if the sun does hit them and the butterflies start to fly around, these sacks just disintegrate and become 10,000 orange butterflies flying. And it's quite amazing to see.
Okay, now we're obliged to be scientific and fact-based. So, Devon, tell us the life cycle of individual monarch butterfly. Now, we're told that it takes like 3 generations for them to get here from Mexico, and then the 4th generation gets to fly all the way back.
Well,
Is
you
that
know
right?
what? I'll tell you the part that happens here, because that's what I know best. I know Jen knows the rest. But in my backyard, there's lots of milkweed, and all of the local gardeners, I think, know that there's a special relationship between monarchs and milkweed, and that's because the monarch caterpillars, when they're in that caterpillar life stage, they must eat milkweed. They can't eat anything else. Even if a butterfly lands on your tree leaves or in your garden plants, their babies can't eat that. They must eat milkweed. And that's partly because when they eat milkweed, they acquire toxins that make them unpalatable or undigestible to various birds. And then the caterpillars have that bright coloring that advertises, look at me, I'm a poisonous caterpillar, so they don't get eaten. So they must eat milkweed. That's when they're caterpillars. And then they do their metamorphosis and they become butterflies. And then they start the complicated next 4 generations that involve going to Mexico, which I know Jen understands better than I do.
So if you're a gardener in the Hudson Valley, you want to be planting one of the species of milkweed that grow here, right?
That's right.
Yes, and that's one thing we learned that I didn't know. I thought milkweed is milkweed. So there's certain plants that are types of milkweed. Like I think somebody gave me some Amsonia once, which is a form of milkweed, and they don't touch it. Different parts of the country and different parts of the world where they will eat different species of milkweed. But we learned you should always plant the one that's most common where you are, because that's what they're used to and that's what they will use.
That's the one that will plant itself anyway.
That's exactly.
Syriaca, right? It's the common milkweed.
Syriaca is the one that's common here.
Mm-hmm.
So I shouldn't be planting swamp milkweed and butterfly weed in my garden?
Well, they're beautiful, and monarchs will use them, and they make much nicer pretty plants if you have a little flower garden outside your front door.
But swamp milkweed, I think, I have a lot of swamp milkweed around my pond, and they love it.
Yeah.
They'll strip that one.
Well, that's a fun plant to watch anyway, because they're not the only animals that live off that. There's a whole bunch of different kinds of insects, and it's fascinating to watch one of those plants through a season.
Yeah.
That's one of the reasons why milkweed's such a great plant, right? Because it's unique, because it's a larval host plant, but it's also a nectar plant, right?
Oh, yeah. The flowers are loved by a great many insects.
And what I've noticed, and a lot of my friends have noticed that are butterfly fans, is that the monarchs, the adults, tend to show up on the day that the common milkweed comes into flower, which is really fascinating. So, and when we'll all write to each other, I just saw the first monarch. Yeah, the flowers are starting
like they
today.
know,
It's
huh?
like they know.
That's like my hummingbirds with the bleeding hearts.
Yeah.
Same thing. Same thing. They know.
Yeah.
They know.
So how do you, as a gardener, how do you plant milkweed? Do you buy the plants? Do you plant seeds? What do you do, Devon,
Well, I'm
to
lucky. I
grow
don't
your
have
crop?
to think about it because part of my backyard is an old hayfield, and old hayfields turn into milkweed on their own, and I just leave it alone. And the one thing I have done is I used to cut that field every year, and after I started to read about these issues, I realized, why am I cutting it every year? You don't need to cut something every year to keep it from turning into trees. Once every few years is enough. So now I keep the trees down by just going out there with clippers, and I leave it uncut, and it's full of milkweed.
So you're managing your milkweed.
Yeah, she's a manager. Well, then why are monarchs endangered anyway? Everybody's all in a panic about the monarchs.
Well, there's a couple of reasons, and it depends on which end of your migration you're at. In our area, there's much less milkweed because there are fewer farms. And old-style farms, the kind of farms that were in our area around 1900, they would be small family farms with hedgerows in between fields, and the hedgerows were full of milkweed. Now, if you have a farm, you're talking about 1,000 acres in Iowa, and they maintain them with pesticides and herbicides, and they just do not have milkweed because they're dousing it with herbicides. So there's less, at this end of the migration, there's less for the monarch caterpillars to eat. And at the other end of the migration, there are developmental issues too.
Well, yeah, at the other end in Mexico, they knew that the monarchs migrated, but they didn't find these places until 1975 when they first found where they were. And some of these mining towns, they would do a lot of logging and mining for resources. And so they were destroying the forests as well. And one of the things that is good about ecotourism is, it supports the local communities and some of the better groups. And so these little towns have now converted from being mining towns to being places with hotels for people to stay, and very, very rustic places to stay, and developing the local economy to protect the monarchs. So that stopped a lot of the illegal mining and logging.
By the way, one thing I was
so.
surprised to see about the mining towns is that this town that we went to, Anganguea, was a mining town in the 1600s. And as I said, this is
Wow.
in the mountains 2 hours from what's now Mexico City at high elevation. But you take your gold and silver where you find them. And, that's how old this town is.
Are the areas protected now, or are they like
As Jen
national
said,
parks?
there are, I
Or
think, 7 different places where the monarchs are known to go.
There's 12. There's 12 that they know of, but 4 of them are sanctuaries that are, and a lot of them are just almost impossible to get up to. This is pretty high up, but these sanctuaries that they let people in, Devon and I saw military police coming in giant trucks to actually protect both the tourists and the butterfly things.
And how did you find it? Did you just go online and search for monarch habitat?
World Wildlife Fund.
WWF.
Yeah.
So we could probably include a link to that in the show notes, right? So if people want to go there, as well as information on growing
And by the way,
milkweed, right?
the tour guides were just so wonderful. I mean, they were fantastic.
They would not only show us the butterflies and things, but they were bird lovers, so some of the exceptional hummingbirds down there. And they would also help us with photography, taking good pictures. They'd grab our cameras. They were also helping some of the local children. Most of the tourists we saw there were Mexicans.
One of the favorite pictures I took was of our guide, Fernando, who had set up a spotting scope for us so that we could get a nice close-up view of the butterflies, actually bending over and introducing like this class of what looked like second graders. So they were all lined up and looking through the spotting scope, and it was just a great picture.
Do they tag butterflies? Is that possible that they could have a small tag?
They do tag butterflies. And this guide I was just talking about, Fernando, said you're not allowed to touch the butterflies, of course, but he once saw a butterfly that had a tag, and he actually, held it in his hand because he wanted to see the tag number. I mean, that's what tags are for, right?
And who's doing? Is there a group that's doing
They
research
have
on them?
Monarch Watch, and some of the people that were on the tour. It was a small group we were in. There were 2 tour guides. There were 14 people total. So like 7 people per tour guide. And one of the couples that was there were from Massachusetts, and the woman was a school teacher, and she had been training her kids with a Monarch way station. So they were actually putting tags on the Monarchs with her school kids. And she always wanted to go and see where they went. And so she was part of our tour. You can actually go online and learn how to do it. And anyone can really do it. And then they track it. That's how they first found out where they were.
So they know of about a dozen of these sites. There might be another dozen that nobody knows about.
And that nobody's actually walking through those sites. Right?
Yeah, and that they're happily just doing the thing.
Yeah.
I did read recently that the count would have been 2021. The population was up by something like 35%. Of who showed up.
Which is great.
That's a good thing.
Is it because we're all planting milkweed? Is that why? I'd like to feel that that's the reason.
I'd like to think that too.
That would be hopeful.
Well, if everybody plants some, right? Then
well, let's
we'll
talk
have
about
more.
the milkweed.
Yeah.
I mean, it's not just us at this end of the trail.
Right.
There's all these people in between that have to be planting milkweed.
That's right, in Texas and all those places that they stop, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So is there like a trail of milkweed?
Yeah, hopefully.
I mean, they say with different things that they have connections with gardens and forestry and things like that. So apparently, maybe that's improving as well.
But as you said, I think it's probably different species for different places because I know like common milkweed, it has to be cold stratified. So I'm sure that that's not growing in Texas, right?
And the milkweed isn't for the adults who are migrating. The milkweed
Right.
is important for the caterpillars before they metamorphose into adults.
What do they eat as adults?
They can eat all kinds of flowers. They eat nectar. But
so the
it doesn't
milkweed
have to
doesn't
be
matter.
When it's an adult butterfly flitting about, it doesn't have to be
So
on a
you have to
milkweed
plant
flower.
nectar plants and milkweed,
Yes.
right?
Yeah.
Because there's 3 generations coming
Right.
back that still
That's right.
need the milkweed.
I think
Right.
we've got it now.
I think we've got it figured out.
And all sorts of butterflies and other insects are like that. They need their specialized larval food, but they also need food for the adults. And these can be a different array of plants.
Host
Life is
plants.
Host
complicated.
plants, yeah.
Host plant, thank you. Larval host plants. They need the larval host plants, but they also need food.
Yeah, and host
adults.
plants for some other butterflies are plants you wouldn't even think of, like trees and
Yeah.
weeds and
Oak trees.
nettle. And,
Oak trees are
yeah.
host plants for a great many insects and butterflies.
You guys got anything that you think we didn't ask you about that you want people to know?
We had some very interesting people. Mm-hmm. This was very high up. You would ride horses, you would hike up. One of the more interesting people on our group was Lori, who was she was like 86. And at high altitude, you really have trouble breathing, And this woman, we'd be walking and puffing, and she's like ahead of all of us. And there was a couple. She was an Alaskan bush pilot, and her partner was a doctor in Alaska. So there were very interesting people we met, too. So if anyone's thinking about doing this, I would really strongly urge you to do it. We really had a good time, and we learned a lot.
Okay, I got to ask, what does it cost to sign up for this trip?
Approximately.
Yeah, ballpark.
$5,000.
And that includes the airfare and everything.
And the food, I hope.
Yeah.
Oh,
Oh,
yeah.
yeah. Everything's included. You don't have to.
Oh, they feed and they
Interesting
fed us
that
very
you would
well.
ask about food, Jean, isn't it?
Yeah.
Because
And
that
they
comes up
take
a
you
lot.
everywhere.
Yeah?
They put you, you put you up.
And how long is the trip?
It's a week.
And in the winter, because
the
that's when
winter.
they're there. Right?
Oh,
Okay.
that makes it even more
Yeah,
appealing.
if
Late
only
winter,
we
yeah.
could talk while we were there, we'd go, right, Jane?
Yeah, they let us
okay.
talk.
Yeah.
Yeah, they
We do
start to
that.
arrive around November, I think.
And you would have loved the food. They
yeah.
had a lot of special things like people making stone ground tortillas for us or feeding us tamarind mojitos.
That alone, I don't even need to see
Mojitos, wait a minute, she's getting closer.
Well, thanks so much, Devon and Jen, for joining us. This has been really interesting. It makes me want to go down and see the Monarchs.
You should.
You should.
And thanks for having us.
Thank you for coming.
that concludes another episode of Nature Calls, Conversations from the Hudson Valley. We would like to thank Sandra Linnell and Devon Connolly from Cornell Cooperative Extension of Columbia and Greene Counties for production support. And a special thank you to our listeners for joining us on this episode of Nature Calls, Conversations from the Hudson Valley. You can find links to any of the topics mentioned in this episode at our website at ccecolumbiagreen.org. Comments and suggestions for future topics may be directed to us at columbiagreenmgb@cornell.edu or on the CCE Master Gardener Volunteers of Columbia and Greene Counties Facebook page. For more information about Cornell Cooperative Extension of Columbia and Greene Counties, visit our website at ccecolumbiagreen.org or visit us in Hudson or in Acre. Cornell Cooperative Extension provides equal programming and employment opportunities